The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel heavy, every whisper echo too loudly. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the mahogany benches and the sea of solemn faces. At the center of it all stood Jamal Thompson, a scrawny 12-year-old boy with wide, wary eyes and shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. His dark skin was marked by the faint scars of a life lived too hard too soon, and his hands cuffed in front of him clenched and unclenched nervously. The judge presiding over his case, the Honorable Evelyn Carter, was known for her no-nonsense demeanor, her sharp tongue, and her unwavering commitment to the letter of the law. She had seen countless juvenile offenders pass through her courtroom, and she prided herself on being unmoved by sob stories, until today. Jamal's case had seemed routine at first glance. Petty theft, trespassing, another kid caught in the cycle of poverty and neglect. His public defender, a weary but kind-eyed man named Mr. Ruiz, had argued for leniency, citing Jamal's unstable foster placements and lack of parental guidance. The prosecutor, a crisp-suited woman with a permanent frown, had pushed for stricter consequences, insisting that Jamal was a repeat offender who needed to learn accountability. Judge Carter had listened, her expression unreadable, her pen poised to deliver her ruling until Jamal, who had been silent the entire hearing, suddenly lifted his head and locked eyes with her. His voice, soft but unwavering, cut through the courtroom like a blade. "You're my mom." For a heartbeat the room froze. The bailiff's hand halfway to adjusting his belt stilled. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the stenograph machine. Even the usual rustle of papers and muffled coughs ceased. Judge Carter's breath hitched, her polished facade cracking for the first time in her 20-year career. Her dark eyes, usually so sure and commanding, flickered with something unrecognizable: shock, fear, guilt. Jamal didn't look away. He held her gaze, his own eyes brimming with a mix of defiance and desperate hope. The photograph he clutched in his cuffed hands, a creased, faded image of a younger woman who bore a striking resemblance to the judge, trembled slightly. The silence stretched, suffocating, until the prosecutor finally broke it with a disbelieving, "Your Honor?" Judge Carter's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Court is adjourned." And with that, she stood abruptly, her robes swirling behind her as she retreated to her chambers, leaving the courtroom in stunned chaos. Outside, the press swarmed like vultures, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions no one could answer. Jamal was led away by a bewildered social worker, his face unreadable. Mr. Ruiz exchanged a stunned glance with the prosecutor. Neither of them had seen this coming. And in her chambers, Judge Evelyn Carter sank into her chair, her hands shaking as she stared at her own reflection in the polished desk. Memories she had buried years ago clawed their way to the surface. A reckless spring break in her final year of law school, a whirlwind romance with a charming but unreliable man, a pregnancy she was told had ended in a miscarriage. She had mourned in secret, buried her grief in her work, and built a life of precision and control, only to have it all unravel in a single moment. Was it possible? Could this boy, this troubled child she might have sentenced in another courtroom on another day, truly be her? And if he was, what did that make her? Meanwhile, Jamal sat in a small windowless room in the juvenile detention center, his mind racing. He had spent years searching, clinging to the only clue he had, a photograph given to him by a dying foster mother who had whispered, "Your real mama's out there. She's somebody important." He had carried that picture like a talisman, studying it in stolen moments, dreaming of the day he'd find her. And now he had. But the woman in the photo wasn't just somebody important, she was a judge. A woman who held power over lives, including his. Did she even care? Would she help him, or would she bury the truth like she'd buried him years ago? Back in the courthouse, whispers spread like wildfire, clerks gossiped in hushed tones, reporters scrambled for sources, and the district attorney's office braced for a scandal. Judge Carter's phone buzzed incessantly, calls from colleagues, from the press, from the Judicial Review Board, but she ignored them all, her mind consumed by one terrifying thought: what have I done? By nightfall, the story had leaked. News outlets ran with sensational headlines: Judge Secret Son stuns courtroom, abandoned boy confronts mother on the bench. The public was divided, some sympathized with Jamal, Others questioned his motive, and Evelyn Carter, the woman who had always been so sure of right and wrong, found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own making. The DNA test had already been ordered, but in her heart, she already knew the truth. The boy with her eyes, her chin, her stubborn tilt of the head, he was her, and she had failed him in every way imaginable. As the city buzzed with speculation, Jamal lay on his thin cot, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know what would happen next. Would she take him in? Would she reject him? Or worse, would she use her power to silence him forever? One thing was certain, his life would never be the same, and neither would hers. Judge Evelyn Carter's chambers, usually a sanctuary of order and control, now felt like a prison closing in around her. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, her legs gave way and she collapsed into the high-backed leather chair, her trembling fingers fumbling with the clasp of her robe, as if the weight of it might suffocate her. The boy's words, "You're my mom," echoed in her skull, each repetition sending a fresh wave of nausea through her. She had spent 2 decades building a life of precision, of black and white morality, where the law was her compass and emotion had no place in her courtroom. But now the past had erupted into her present with the force of a detonated bomb, and the carefully constructed walls of her existence were crumbling. Her mind raced back to her final year of law school, spring break in Miami, the reckless abandon of youth, the intoxicating charm of Daniel Reeves, a man whose smile could melt resistance, but whose promises dissolved like sugar in rain. They had been inseparable for those 7 days, and when she returned home, her body still humming with the memory of him, she had convinced herself it was just a fling, until the nausea started, until the test turned positive. She had called Daniel, her voice shaking, and his response had been ice cold. "You sure it's mine?" he'd asked, followed by a dismissive, "Handle it." She had, or so she thought. The doctor had been gentle but firm. "There's no heartbeat." She had grieved in silence, buried the pain beneath case law and caffeine, and told no one, not her parents, not her friends, certainly not the man who had already moved on. But now, staring at the closed door of her chambers, Evelyn wondered if she had been lied to, if that heartbeat had existed after all, if her child had been taken from her without her ever knowing. Across town, Jamal sat on the edge of a stiff cot in the juvenile detention center's holding room, his fingers tracing the frayed edges of the photograph he'd kept hidden in his shoe for years. The woman in the picture was younger, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pinned back in a stern bun, but the sharpness in her eyes was the same. Judge Carter. He had recognized her instantly the first time he'd seen her on the local news months ago. Since then, he'd studied every article, every clip, memorizing the curve of her jaw, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. He had planned this moment for weeks, waiting for his latest arrest, petty theft, breaking into an empty garage to sleep, knowing his case would land in her courtroom. He hadn't expected the words to spill out like they did, raw and unplanned. Now he clenched his fists, torn between triumph and terror. What if she denied him? What if she had him shipped off to some group home, where no one would believe him? The social worker assigned to his case, a tired-looking woman named Alvarez, had been whispering urgently with the detention center staff since they'd brought him in. Now she stepped into the room, her expression unreadable. "They've ordered a DNA test," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "It'll take a few days." Jamal nodded, his throat tight. He had spent his life in the system, passed between foster homes where he was either ignored or resented. The last family had thrown him out after he got into a fight at school. "We can't handle a problem child," they'd said, as if he hadn't spent years begging to be handled at all. The photograph was all he had left of the woman who'd given him up, or so he'd thought. Back at the courthouse, Evelyn's phone buzzed incessantly, calls from the chief judge, from reporters, from colleagues pretending to check in but really digging for gossip. She silenced it, her mind raced. If Jamal was hers, how had he ended up in the system? Daniel, the name curdled in her stomach. He had been the last person to know about the pregnancy. Had he lied about the miscarriage? Had he sold their child, given him away? The possibilities made her lightheaded. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Her private investigator, a grizzled ex-cop named Frank Mercer, answered on the first ring. "I need you to find Daniel Reeves," she said, her voice low and urgent. "And I need everything you can dig up on an adoption or a birth record from 20 years ago." Frank didn't ask questions. He'd worked for Evelyn long enough to know when she was on the edge of something explosive. By nightfall, the story had leaked. News vans surrounded the courthouse, their satellite antennas piercing the sky like spears. Headlines blared: "Judge, Secret Son, Scandal Rocks the Bench, and Abandoned Boy's Custody Battle Begins." Evelyn's face was everywhere, her professional reputation unraveling in real time. She avoided the cameras, slipping out a back exit with her coat pulled high, but there was no escaping the storm. At home, she poured herself a glass of wine, her hands steady only through sheer force of will. The DNA test would confirm the truth soon enough, but in her gut, she already knew. Jamal's eyes. Her eyes had held a lifetime of pain she couldn't ignore, and if he was hers, she owed him more than a courtroom apology. She owed him the truth. Meanwhile, in his detention center room, Jamal stared at the ceiling, his chest tight with a hope he couldn't suppress. For the first time in his life, someone might finally fight for him, or she might destroy him completely. The DNA test results arrived in a plain manila envelope, its unassuming appearance belying the seismic shift it would bring to Judge Evelyn Carter's life. She sat alone in her dimly lit study, the weight of the envelope in her hands heavier than any legal brief she'd ever held. The past 72 hours had been a blur of sleepless nights, frantic research, and hushed phone calls with her private investigator, Frank Mercer, who had uncovered a trail of deceits stretching back 2 decades. With a deep breath, she slid her finger under the seal and pulled out the single sheet of paper, her eyes scanning the cold, clinical language, until they landed on the conclusive phrase, "Probability of maternity, 99. The room swayed around her, the words searing into her mind like a brand. Jamal was her son, her child, the one she had mourned as lost before he ever took his first breath, had been alive all this time, growing up in the fractured labyrinth of foster care. While she sat on the bench, presiding over cases just like his with detached authority, the irony was cruel enough to choke her. Across town, Jamal paced the narrow confines of his temporary group home room, his stomach knotted with a volatile mix of hope and resentment. The social workers had been treating him differently since the courtroom incident, less dismissive, almost cautious, as if he were a lit fuse they weren't sure how to diffuse. Miss Alvarez had told him the DNA results were coming today, but no one had bothered to update him yet. He clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. She knows by now, if she cared she'd be here. The thought twisted in his chest. Part of him had dared to imagine a tearful reunion, a mother's arms wrapping around him for the first time, but the louder, angrier part sneered at his own naivety. Judge Carter was a powerful woman. If she'd wanted him, she would have found him years ago. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she dialed Frank's number. "It's confirmed," she said, her voice raw. "What else have you found?" Frank's exhale was audible through the phone. "Daniel sold him," he said bluntly. "Faked the miscarriage records, paid off a nurse and handed the baby to a black market adoption ring. The trail goes cold after that." But Jamal resurfaced in the system at age 5 after his adoptive parents died in a car crash. Evelyn's vision blurred with rage. Daniel had stolen her son, not just from her but from a life of safety, of love, and she, oblivious, had spent years upholding a system that failed children like Jamal every day. The guilt was a living thing, gnawing at her from the inside. She made her decision in an instant. Grabbing her coat, she strode to her car, ignoring the reporters still camped on her lawn. The group home address burned in her mind. She had to see him, now. Jamal was staring out the grimy window when a sleek black car screeched to a halt outside. His breath caught as Judge Carter, no, Evelyn, stepped out, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed. For a wild second he considered bold, but then their gazes met through the glass and something in her expression, something shattered and desperate, rooted him to the spot. The staff, recognizing her, let her in without protest. When she finally stood before him, the words tumbled out in a rush. "Jamal, I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know." Her voice broke on the last word, and to his horror, Jamal felt his own eyes burn. "You weren't there," he whispered. "You weren't there when I needed you." The dam burst. Evelyn reached for him, then stopped herself, her hands hovering helplessly. "I'm here now," she said, the plea in her voice unmistakable. "Let me fix this." Outside, unnoticed by either of them, a reporter's camera flashed, capturing the moment Judge Evelyn Carter's carefully constructed life collided with the son she never knew she had. The fluorescent lights of the group home's visitation room hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the chipped formica table where Jamal sat, his shoulders hunched defensively as he studied Evelyn Carter, his mother, through narrowed eyes. She looked nothing like the unshakable judge from TV. Her usually pristine blazer was wrinkled, her manicured fingers drumming nervously against her knee, and there was a rawness in her gaze that made something in his chest twist uncomfortably. He wanted to hate her. He did hate her, at least part of him did, the part that remembered freezing nights in group homes where no one remembered his birthday, the part that still flinched at raised voices because his last foster father had liked to backhand him for talking back. But another part, a stupid, hopeful part he couldn't quite smother, kept fixating on the way she'd said "I didn't know," like the words were being ripped out of her. Evelyn fought to keep her voice steady. "The adoption was illegal," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "Police reports, forged medical records, a trail of lies so meticulously crafted it made her sick. Daniel paid someone to fake my miscarriage paperwork. You were sold to a couple in another state, but when they died, you fell through the cracks of the system." Jamal's fingers twitched toward the documents but didn't touch them. "So what?" he muttered. "You gonna sue him or something? That don't change where I been." The accusation hung between them sharp as glass. Evelyn flinched. "No," she admitted quietly. "It doesn't, but I can try to make sure you never go back there." Jamal barked a laugh. "You mean like what? You're gonna take me in now? Play happy family?" He shoved back from the table, his chair screeching against the linoleum. "I ain't some case you can close with a gavel, lady." Evelyn stood abruptly, her control snapping. "I know that." The outburst startled them both. She took a shaky "Jamal, I spent 20 years thinking you were dead, and now I find out you were out there alone." Her voice cracked. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but let me help you." For the first time, Jamal really looked at her, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly despite her clenched fists. She wasn't just guilty, she was terrified. The realization unsettled him. Outside, a social worker cleared her throat. "Time's up," she said gently. Evelyn hesitated, then reached into her bag. "I brought you something." She placed a small worn teddy bear on the table, the one she'd bought in a panic after her first ultrasound, then hidden in the back of her closet after the miscarriage. Jamal stared at it, his throat tight. It was stupid, juvenile, but it was proof she'd wanted him once. As Evelyn turned to leave, Jamal's voice stopped her. "They're transferring me to a new foster home tomorrow," he said flatly. "Somewhere stable." She turned back, her eyes blazing. "Over my dead body." The ferocity in her tone made Jamal blink. "I'll be here at 8 a.m., she said, "with a lawyer." That night, Jamal lay awake, the bear tucked under his scratchy blanket. For the first time in years he let himself imagine what it might be like to have someone fight for him. The pre-dawn light had barely begun to bleed through the blinds when Evelyn Carter's Mercedes screeched to a halt outside the group home, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, and a firestorm of legal documents strewn across the passenger seat. She hadn't slept, not after seeing Jamal's face yesterday, not after holding that damn teddy bear again for the first time in 20 years. Its fur still matted with tears she'd shed in secret all those years ago. The social services office wouldn't open for hours, but Evelyn had called in every favor, every political connection she'd spent her career carefully cultivating, and she'd be damned if they transferred Jamal to another nameless foster home before she could stop it. Inside the building, Jamal was already awake, dressed in the same too small hoodie he'd been wearing during his arrest, his few possessions stuffed into a garbage bag at his feet. The social worker, a tired-looking man with a clipboard, checked his watch impatiently. "Transport's late," he muttered, but Jamal barely heard him. His attention was locked on the window, where Evelyn Carter was storming up the walkway like a hurricane in heels, flanked by two attorneys carrying briefcases thick enough to bludgeon someone. The door burst open before the staff could react. "I'm filing an emergency petition for temporary guardianship," Evelyn announced. her voice slicing through the room with the same authority she wielded in her courtroom, but there was something raw beneath it, something desperate. The social worker blinked. "Judge Carter, protocol requires." "Protocol be damned," she snapped, thrusting a sheaf of papers at him. DNA confirmation, character affidavits from 3 sitting judges, and a motion to expedite signed by family court. "Jamal comes with me today." Jamal, watching from the corner, felt something dangerous flicker in his chest. Hope, or maybe just the vindication of seeing adults scramble because of him for once. But the old bitterness rose like bile. "What if I don't want to go with you?" he challenged. Lifting his chin, the room froze. Evelyn turned to him, and for the first time, Jamal saw the cracks in her armor, the slight tremble in her hand as she reached for him, the way her voice softened when she said, "Then I'll sit right here until you're ready, but I'm not leaving without you again." The words hung between them, heavy with 20 years of absence. Jamal wanted to resist, to punish her, for all those lost years, but the garbage bag at his feet, containing everything he owned in the world, suddenly seemed pathetic compared to the fierce determination in Evelyn's eye. He grabbed the bag. "Whatever, but I ain't calling you Mom." Evelyn's breath caught, but she nodded, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the grief and gratitude beneath. "Fair enough," she murmured, and when she led him out to the car, her hand hovered near his back, not quite touching, as if she were afraid he'd vanish if she made contact. The drive to Evelyn's brownstone was silent. Jamal pressed against the passenger door like he might bolt at any second, his eyes darting over the luxurious interior with suspicion. Evelyn kept stealing glances at him, her mind reeling. This was her son, her baby, now a hardened teenager, who flinched at sudden movements and spoke like every word cost him something. What had they done to him? What had she allowed to happen? Her fingers tightened on the wheel. Daniel would pay for this. The legal system would pay. She'd burn it all down if she had to. When they arrived, Jamal froze on the doorstep, staring at the gleaming foyer like it was a museum exhibit. "You live here alone?" he asked, and the unspoken question, why hadn't she needed a family when he'd needed one so badly, lodged like a knife in Evelyn's ribs. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "It's too big for one person." For a heartbeat, something fragile passed between them, the ghost of the life they might have had. Then Jamal shouldered past her, his sneakers leaving faint marks on the pristine hardwood. "Which room's mine?" he demanded, and Evelyn exhaled, trailing after him. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in 2 decades, they were under the same roof. That night, Evelyn sat awake outside Jamal's closed door, listening to the muffled sounds of him pacing inside. Down the hall, the teddy bear sat propped on her dresser, a silent witness to all they'd lost, and all she was determined to reclaim. The grandfather clock in Evelyn Carter's foyer chimed 3 a.m., its hollow echoes bouncing off the vaulted ceilings, as she sat frozen at the kitchen island, her untouched coffee gone cold between her palms. Upstairs, Jamal's bedroom door remained firmly shut, had been since he'd slammed it 8 hours earlier, after a vicious argument about the house rules she'd naively assumed he'd follow. "You ain't the boss of me," he'd snarled, his voice cracking with a rage that seemed to shake the crystal pendant lights overhead. And Evelyn had stood there in her designer blouse, and bare feet, realizing with dawning horror that she had no idea how to be a mother. Not to this wounded, feral boy who'd spent a lifetime surviving in the trenches while she'd been handing down verdicts from her ivory tower. The silence now was worse than the shout. Down the hall the refrigerator hummed, its stainless steel facade reflecting the gaunt shadows under her eyes. When had she last slept? Eaten? The teddy bear she'd given Jamal sat abandoned on the staircase, one threadbare arm outstretched as if begging for rescue. Behind the closed door, Jamal paced like a caged animal, his pulse throbbing in his temples. The bedroom was bigger than any he'd ever had, king-sized bed, ensuite bathroom, a damn chandelier, but the walls felt like they were closing in. He'd trashed the stupid polo shirt Evelyn left on his bed. "We have a dinner with my colleagues tomorrow," hurling it at the mirror and watching his own fractured reflection sneer back at him in the glass. Who did she think she was? Trying to dress him up like some prep school puppet after he'd spent years scrounging for clothes at Salvation Army bin. The whole house reeked of money,
and false perfection, from the abstract art no normal person could understand, to the fridge stocked with organic kale and fucking pomegranate juice. Jamal kicked the bed frame, savoring the pain that shot up his toe. He wanted her to hear it, wanted her to hurt like he did. A crash from downstairs shattered the stalemate. Evelyn was on her feet before her brain registered the sound, glass breaking, a muffled curse. She took the stairs two at a time, her silk robe flaring behind her, and skidded into the kitchen to find Jamal standing amid the wreckage of her favorite wedding china, his bare feet perilously close to the shards. "I was thirsty," he muttered defiantly, but Evelyn saw the way his fingers trembled at his sides. Without thinking, she crossed the space between them and grabbed his wrists, turning his palms upward. Fresh cuts, blood welling in the crease. Jamal tried to yank away, but she held fast, her voice low and frayed. "Look at me." When he finally did, the raw panic in his eyes mirrored her own. This wasn't rebellion, it was the first aid kit was still open on the counter from when she'd patched up his scraped knuckles after the arrest. Wordlessly, Evelyn led him to the sink, her hands steady as she rinsed each cut, applied antibiotic ointment, wrapped them in bandages too white for hands that had seen so much violence. Jamal watched her, his breath coming fast, waiting for the lecture, the punishment. Instead, Evelyn reached past him and pulled a Coca-Cola from the fridge, the cheap sugary kind she'd never allow in her house, and cracked it open with a hiss. "I hated kale too at your age," she said, pushing it toward him. The laugh that escaped Jamal was startled, rusty, like a door hinge, unused for years. He took the soda, their fingers brushing, and for one fragile moment, the gulf between them didn't seem so wide. Down the street, unnoticed by either of them, a reporter's long lens camera captured the scene through the kitchen window. The judge and the delinquent, bathed in refrigerator light, looking more like family than either would admit. The rain hammered against the windows of Evelyn Carter's brownstone like 1,000 accusing fingers, the kind of storm that made the walls tremble and the lights flicker, an omen of the chaos about to erupt. Jamal stood in the center of the living room, his chest heaving, the morning's newspaper crumpled in his fist, like a grenade with the pin pulled. The headline screamed up at him in bold, unforgiving print: "Judge long-lost son, a criminal past exposed." Below it, his juvenile records, sealed, supposedly, were splashed across the front page for the world to see. Arrests for shoplifting, trespassing, the time he'd punched a foster parent who'd tried to lock him in a closet overnight. The article dissected his life like a lab specimen, painting him as either a victim of systemic failure, or a ticking time bomb depending on which expert they quoted. But the worst part, the photo of him and Evelyn in the kitchen last night, soda cans in hand, framed like some twisted before and after shot of a social experiment gone wrong. Evelyn burst through the front door, her usually immaculate hair plastered to her face by the storm, her phone buzzing incessantly in her purse. She'd been at an emergency hearing, one she'd called to fast-track Jamal's permanent guardianship, when the news broke. The second she saw the paper in his hands, her stomach dropped. "Jamal, you knew this would happen," he exploded, hurling the newspaper at her feet. "You knew they'd dig up every fucking mistake I ever made." His voice cracked, raw with betrayal. He'd started to believe, really believe, that she might see him as more than just a charity case, a redemption project. But now the whole world knew him as Judge Carter's dirty little secret, the thug she was foolish enough to bring into her perfect life. Evelyn stepped forward, her heels crunching over the ruined paper. "I didn't leak this," she said, her voice low and urgent, "but I know who did." She pulled out her phone, showing Jamal an email from her investigator. Daniel Reeves had been spotted meeting with a reporter from the Tribune yesterday, the same reporter who'd written the hit piece. "He's trying to discredit you before the custody hearing," she said, her jaw tightening. "Because if you look unstable, the court won't let me keep you." Jamal's breath came in short, ragged bursts. Daniel, the man who'd sold him, the man who'd stolen his life before it even started. Rage, white-hot and blinding, surged through him. He grabbed his hoodie from the couch. "Where are you going?" Evelyn demanded, blocking the door. "To find him." The words were a snarl. "And then what?" Evelyn shot back, her voice rising for the first time. "You'll end up in juvie, or worse, and he wins. Is that what you want?" Jamal froze, His fists clenched. She was right, and he hated her for it. Hated that she could still think like a judge when all he could think about was revenge.